more details have emerged on the mysterious phone call between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and his Russian counterpart. Just what made the Defense Secretary of Russia pick up the phone with no notice? And what does it mean for the Ukrainians? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is a really interesting story because we've talked earlier about the phone call, the second phone call between Russia's defense minister and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, right? Now, as we've pointed out, that since the Russian invasion 2 years ago, Lloyd Austin and Russia's defense minister, previously Sergei Shoigu, now and Andrei Belousov, have only spoken 5 times, and almost always when the Pentagon has reached out and said, hey, we'd like to call and talk about an issue, right? And again, the Pentagon always doing it in an effort to avoid miscalculations, right? It's called deconfliction. And Lloyd Austin had reached out to Andrei Belousov just a few weeks earlier, right? On June 25th, he called. And this makes sense because Andrei is a new Russian defense minister. He's new to the position. He actually has limited experience in the Ministry of Defense kind of roles. So for his counterpart in the United States to pick up the phone and say, hey, this is me. You are my peer. If you ever need to deconflict or share critical information, you can pick up the phone and call me. I can call you. We just want to make sure we're just touching base, right? The same thing you would do in your office if somebody you interacted with, in a critical role was to suddenly be replaced with a new person. You'd at least want to come by and say hi, right? So Austin does that, but then something really strange happens. And remember, up until this point, so we've only had 5 total calls, one of which was this intro call, and one of which was this mystery call that happened just a few days later, meaning that before this set of phone calls occurred, the Secretary of Defense and his Russian counterpart had only spoken 3 times since the start of the conflict, which is utterly insane. It doesn't mean that lower level operators aren't in constant communication. But again, the fact that these 2 key players have very limited discussions up until this point is pretty interesting. So then, after this phone call, just 2 weeks later, Belousov picks up the phone and calls Lloyd Austin. Now, the official Pentagon statement, right? Let's see if we can find it. It's a call between Lloyd Austin and Russian defense from the whitehouse.gov, I think. Here we go. You can see, here's the June 25th phone call. They just said, very, very simple. They spoke. This was the first phone call, emphasized the importance of maintaining lines of communication in the ongoing war against Ukraine. That's it. That's the summary of the first phone call. Then the summary of the second phone call on July 12th. Officially, the Pentagon says that they spoke by phone, that Lloyd Austin spoke by phone today with the Russian Minister of Defense. Secretary Austin emphasized the importance of maintaining lines of communication amid Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. A very vague write-up and very strange given the fact that they spoke 2 weeks ago and officially talked about the exact same thing. But it turns out what they really talked about, that was technically true, that it was important to maintain lines of communication amid the war in Ukraine. But there's a little more details to this. Belousov called because Russian intel had received a warning, right? That the Russians had detected a covert Ukrainian operation in the works against Russia, and they believed this plot might have actually had the Americans' blessing. And Belousov says, whatever this plot was, it was so crazy. Belousov said, yo, we need to call the Americans. Belousov called the Americans and said, hey, are you aware of this? And its potential to really escalate the war in ways that we may not be able to control. And according to this leaked statement, Pentagon officials were like, what are you talking about? We don't know anything about this. And we've never heard of any such plot. And this is according to U.S. officials speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss the phone call. And whatever Belousov revealed, the three officials said, it was taken seriously enough that Americans, Lloyd Austin or his staff, put down the phone with Belousov and then dialed the Ukrainians and said, hey, don't know if you're doing thing X, but if you're thinking about it, don't. And so while Ukraine has obviously coordinated and collaborated with the U.S. for military intelligence and diplomatic support, Ukrainian officials oftentimes do their own thing. And that makes sense, right? They are fighting their own war. And ultimately, they know that America is as steadfast an ally as you could ask for. But just like any friend, everyone has their limits. And sometimes the Ukrainians probably recognize that telling the Americans everything is going to make them liable, right? Because again, it's going to increase the operational risks, but it's also going to make the Americans say, hey, listen, I don't think you should do it, right? The Ukrainians probably didn't ask permission to strike those Russian oil refineries. And the Americans very publicly said, listen, we can't tell the Ukrainians what to do, but we don't like this. And the Ukrainians said, we didn't ask the Americans for permission to do this. Right? And so that is actually a de-escalatory process where the Americans go, listen, we can try to rein them in a little bit, but they're not using our weapons to launch these. They're building their drones at home. So we can't really stop this. Right? And the Russians go, okay, you can't really stop it. We get it. But apparently, whatever this plot was, the Russians were so perturbed by it that they said, yo, this seems over the top and escalatory in a way that the U.S. may not be able to control. Right? Now, bear in mind, guys, that there's a lot of things that the Ukrainians do that do not warrant a phone call to Lloyd Austin. Strikes inside Russia itself, didn't get a phone call. Truck bombing that destroyed part of the Kursk bridge, didn't get a phone call from the Russians. Right? Even though Putin claims these are terrorist attacks and Kremlin says it's, Kremlin says it's proof that the Ukrainians want to invade Russia. Okay, sure, boss. So whatever this was, it was more serious than destroying Russia's oil infrastructure. It was more serious than blowing up the Kursk bridge. It was more serious than sinking entire Russian battleships, more serious than taking out Russian air bases in Sevastopol. It was something very real and very serious. Now, here's the thing, guys. Remember, intelligence it's a lot of art. It's a little science, but it's a lot of art. And sometimes you just get it wrong. And sometimes intelligence agencies aren't above a little trolling. Where you sit there and go, oh yeah, we're going to launch a nuke at Putin's vacation home. Yeah, totally, dudes. It's in the works. That nuke is going to be fired tomorrow. And some FSB agent's like, we got him, guys. We heard it. Call the fucking Pentagon. You know? So you got to understand these games are always being played. And here's the thing, guys. This leak itself, we're going to talk a little bit about why this story itself is actually part of the scheme. And before we do, though, if you're looking to escalate your own effectiveness, you don't need to put two superpowers on a collision course for war, okay? You don't need to do that. Maybe you just need a little extra caffeine. Check out some Strike Gum. 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece. That's as much as a Red Bull, as much as an Amp Energy, but it's zero sugar. We also have 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further cognitive sharpness. And best of all, it's made in the USA. It's made down in Denver, right? It's veteran owned. So when you pick up your Strike Gum, because you need an energy drink alternative, something that you don't have to haul around a can of Red Bull when you're driving a truck or working, right? This is all you need. You just pop it, chew it. Your breath is minty fresh. Nobody knows that you're getting your caffeine fix. And here's the thing. It's veteran owned. It's made in the USA. There's no part of this that's enriching China, that's enriching an overseas manufacturer. It's not. It's staying right here in America. Right? And it costs a little extra, sure, but it lets us do a bunch of things. It lets us add good ingredients, right? Like this caffeine, it's not the lab-made stuff made in the lab in, let's be honest, probably in China, right? It's made it's derived from green coffee beans. It's natural caffeine. And when you chew it, you feel it, right? You get that like non-jittery, clean rush. You know, you don't get the like weird kind of, there's something weird about the fake caffeine. Do you know what I'm talking about? When you have pre-workout, right? They use a lot of the encapsulated caffeines. It gives you that like jittery, you don't feel good, right? Whereas coffee, you feel good. Anyway, guys, if you want some Strike Gum, you can go to strikegum.com, pick some up, or you can go to Amazon, just search for Amazon, go to Amazon, search Strike Gum. Link is in the description. You can literally just look down there. Pick some up, right? And kick energy drinks to the curb. Okay. So here's what's kind of the meta here about this leak, right? And the Russian Defense Ministry, right, said, yeah, this call was about preventing security threats and reducing the risk of possible escalation. Not explicitly talking about the suspected Ukrainian covert mission, but again, not ruling it out either. But the fact is that these calls happen all the time. And the United States, like, doesn't leak the content of these calls if they're classified, which this would be, right? And so the fact that this was leaked means that there's some sort of messaging here. And what is the messaging? The messaging, I think, is for two audiences. The first audience is Russia itself. They know that Russian FSB is going to read the New York Times, and they know that the New York Times is closely associated with the Democratic establishment, right, with the White House. And so the U.S. is saying, hey, Russia, we know you called us about this plot. We know we said, hey, we haven't heard anything about it. And you probably noticed that the plot never materialized. And Russia's probably asking itself, hey, was this plot just a red herring? Was it just one of those things that is like fake? It just was never really going to happen. It was just kind of the Ukrainians blowing smoke. They're like, maybe the Americans told the Ukrainians, hey, don't do this now. The Russians are on to you. Wait and do it later. Or they're going to say, well, or maybe the Ukrainians just weren't able to execute the plot for different reasons that we don't know, right? Or maybe the Americans were planning it all along, and when we told them the jig was up, they just abandoned it. And so the Americans, Lloyd Austin and the Pentagon, they want to try to send a message to Russia. And that message is, hey, we heard you. We agree that this was crazy, even though we couldn't say it in the phone call. And we called the Ukrainians and said, if this is true, you guys are crazy. So we're signaling to Russia, hey, this thing you told us about, thanks for telling us. We agree it would have been a huge escalation, and we took steps to make sure it stopped. We don't know if the Ukrainians were really going to do it, but we took action to de-escalate this. And this is a signaling device to the Russians to say, listen, the U.S., we are a partner in de-escalation. You called us because you were really worried about this thing, and we took action, right? We are honest brokers. Just like the U.S. said, hey, when you guys had that terror attack in Moscow, we warned you. We sent you intel and said, this is happening. And then we very publicly tried to alert you by telling the U.S. citizens in Russia, do not go out. Something bad is about to happen. And so the U.S. is sort of saying, hey, listen, we're trying to do our part to stop like pointlessly bad things from happening and to prevent escalations, right? And in turn, Russia's saying, we're trying to do the same thing. And the U.S. is saying, look, we're a partner in this. The other person this audience is for is the voters. Because one of the criticisms directed at the support for Ukraine is that it is a dangerous escalation, that it is putting America and NATO on a collision course with Russia and its Eurasian security architecture, whatever bullshit Putin's making up, right? And they say, it's a collision course. World War III is coming. And this story, part of its messaging is to say, hey, understand that the Ukraine conflict, while bad, while tragic, is a regional conflict that is remaining a regional conflict. It is a regional conflict, by the way, within Ukraine, guys. Okay. The entirety of the fighting, except for some of these drone and missile attacks, which are not good. Like, don't make me sit there and think like they're fine. But the majority of the fighting is happening in a limited region in eastern Ukraine. And as we saw in the interview with Sierski, of that front line, of that 4,000 kilometer front line, only about 1,000 kilometers have actual fighting taking place. And so this is all part of the U.S. signaling to voters, listen, I understand that our critics in the other party are saying that this is an escalation, it's a collision course, World War III is coming. But they say, listen, here's a story in which the Russians reached out to us and said, yo, if you do this, it's going to be a dangerous escalation. And the U.S. said, oh, okay, thank you for telling us. We are going to stop this so that there's no escalatory risk. Right? And it says that, listen, at the level beyond the region, there isn't an escalation risk. People are working hard. The Pentagon is working hard to make sure that while we support Ukraine, we are also keeping this regional conflict regional in all the ways that count. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. A huge thank you to the members of combatvetnews.com. I hope you guys got some value out of this because, again, this is a crazy but also important story. So thanks to the Colonel tier members, James Jerling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Hemmerling, Yanko Georgiev. Could not do this without you guys, as well as the Lieutenant tier members also out here carrying the torch of keeping me independent and getting access to those uncensored combat footage. Thank you, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.